Let me just start by making a few remarks and then turn it over to our very wide-ranging panel. I wrote a book called The Precariat in 2011, and on page 1 I said, unless the insecurities and the aspirations of the precariat are confronted and dealt with, we will see the emergence of a political monster. And you will not be surprised that in November 2016, I received emails from all over the world saying, your monster has arrived. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. After I wrote the book, I talked about revolt and how the precariat was going to be participating in different types of revolt. And I got invited to many Occupy movements, various places, to give speeches on basic income and the precariat and so on. And I'll always remember that there was a mixture. And I wrote in the Precariat Charter that the precariat was split into atavists, people looking back to a lost past, and these were the reactionaries who were going to vote for the populists and neo-fascists, Marine Le Pen, Trump, Orban, various people, and your Turkish example, of course, and in the Netherlands and so on. And then there was the other parts, what I call the nostalgic, the migrants, the millions of people who are migrants, who politically are pushed out of democracy, they're denizens. And then there are the progressives, and I felt that the progressives would move to support a basic income because they are looking for a revival of the capacity to work that I was talking about earlier, and they care about the environment, they care about society, they care about the community, they care about the commons, which we'll talk about tomorrow. And I still think that the progressive part of the precariat is our natural constituency, our natural base. But no radical new politics emerges without some form of class alliance, where different factions of different classes come together with a new rhetoric, a new sense of change. And I think our panel is going to be representing some of the tensions between the old democratic institutions, in particular the dying of social democracy and the dying of Christian democracy, with the new precariat and other movements. And I still think we're in a transition period where many of the new movements like Podemos or Movimento 5 Stelle are essentially muddled, populist, but are breaking the mold. And that we shouldn't be too critical of some of the false steps that they're all making. But I think all of these movements give us an opportunity for inserting a narrative that's got basic income in it. And in particular, of course, at the moment, we've all got in our minds the Gilets jaunes in France, and I'm very pleased to note that our panel begins with several presentations of the Gilets jaunes perspective. And I'm sure that's going to be very interesting. So I'm going to start with Nicole, who's going to lead the way on that discussion.
Hello everyone, can you hear me? Hi. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to speak about these two passionating subjects that are the yellow vest and basic income. Okay, the PowerPoint is arriving. But maybe as an introduction, I would also like to highlight that today I'm going to speak in my very personal perspective. So I want to say that I speak as a woman who lives in Paris, I would say maybe middle class, who has no car, which is important in the context of the Yellow Vests, who is also very much involved in the civil society organizations as a feminist, as an ecologist, and as an advocate for basic income. So, let's continue anyway. I don't know how the PowerPoint works, but I see it in my computer, and you're going to see it at some point. So what's the Yellow Vest movement? This movement that was launched in France, maybe you've heard about it already, but to give you maybe a small presentation, it was a movement, a social movement that appeared in October 2018 in reaction to the government's announcements to raise the fuel tax for ecological reasons. And then the movement spread itself all over France, and so the people started to get together in the roundabouts of the small towns up to the main avenue of the Champs-Élysées in France, where they now gather every Saturday. So this movement, who are the Yellow Vests? According to some studies, we don't really know who the Yellow Vests are, because there has been some polls and studies done up to now, but it's the people who go to the Yellow Vests are very diverse, but we can still have some information about them. Thank you. So, what we know about the majority of the Yellow Vests that go, especially that go to Paris every Saturday, is that these people are what Guy Standing would say the members of the precariat. These are people who work and who can't manage to get a living out of their work, out of their labor. These are also people living in small cities mainly, who can go to work without a car, which is very important because in these places that are in the suburbs or in the countryside, the public transportation is not enough, so you need a car to go to work. So that's why the raise of the fuel tax is so important. These are people, so as I said, who work and who can pay their bills at the end of the month, and more widely, who are also now fed up with the institutional violence from the part of the state that has been stigmatizing them over the years. And this disdain from the part of the current government is actually very tangible, and you can see it especially from the part of the President Emmanuel Macron, who's been saying little sentences since he's been elected, like you only need to cross the street to find a job. And also sentences like you need to responsibilize the poor, or social aid costs hell of a lot of money, à pognon de dingue, as they say in French. So it's easy to understand that the fuel price was actually only the final straw that triggered the Yellow Vest movement. And now the claims are very much wider. What they demand now is more social and fiscal justice, especially the return of the wealth tax, which was removed last year and has become actually a very symbolic claim. But they also ask for an increase of the purchasing power, as well as better public services, among many, many other things. And actually, the ecology, because it was also a debate about ecology, is not an excuse even for the Yellow Vest members, because it was really received from the part of the Yellow members as an excuse from the part of the government to raise the fuel tax. And actually what we could see in some demonstrations, especially in Paris, were slogans like fin du monde, fin du mois, même combat, which means end of the world, end of the month, it's the same fight. So we need to change the system and not the climate. So every Saturday also there's a different topic of demonstration that is highlighted sometimes, like for example the need to link climate justice and social justice, but there were also some demonstrations that highlighted the police brutality, which has intensified over the months. And also another topic that I find is very interesting is the topic of women's rights, especially in one demonstration that was on the 9th of March, so the day after the 8th of March, the International Day for Women's Rights, where women really took the streets to also put the light on their specific condition as women. Sorry. I don't know if it works. Okay. So why the women's involvement is so interesting in the Yellow Vest movement? First, because according to a study, 47% of the Yellow Vests are women, which is quite exceptional in France. It's like way more than in any other demonstration. And also, it's important to stress that in France, 70% of the people living below the poverty line are women, and they also represent 82% of the part-time jobs. And so also the different testimonies we got from the women who were part of the Yellow Vest, that it was that they work mainly in the care sectors. So there were nurses, there were domestic workers, home helpers, and their jobs have not enabled them to live decently. So this is an interesting illustration of the Yellow Vest situation, because this working class is particularly vulnerable, also due to the fact that most of them work in an isolated situation. So what was interesting with the Yellow Vest was that for the first time they got the chance to mobilize themselves, get together and share their experiences, and also start to mobilize themselves to fight for their rights. So now the question is, what link with the basic income? So as a member of the French movement for basic income, and also with the other members of the association, we started to ask ourselves what should be our position in front of the Yellow Vest movement. And in the beginning it was quite complicated for us to get a clear position, because there were members of the extreme right and from the extreme left in part of the Yellow Vest movement. And you actually only need a Yellow Vest to be part of the movement, so it's not weird. So at first we remained very cautious, but then as the main claims that are claims of fiscal justice especially, the question was partly solved for us. But then the second issue was, as this is a social movement, this clearly doesn't want any leader or organizations to represent them. Can we really intervene in this context? So we didn't want to be accused of distortion, so at first we decided not to do anything, which wasn't really the right answer, because then we started to receive some emails and messages from Yellow Vest members who were part of the French movement for basic income and others were not, who were saying, but where are you? Basic income should clearly be in this debate. How come that you're doing nothing? Do you really exist? So we started saying, okay, yes, we should intervene in this context. And so we started to be part of the debates, to talk with the Yellow Vest, and also to publish some articles in the mainstream media. And most importantly, we started to explain why basic income was important according to us in this context. Yes? Okay. I'll be very, very quick. So what are the reasons why we identified basic income as relevant in this context? The first reason is because clearly this movement has shown that having a job doesn't mean having decent living conditions. So people are losing their lives in trying to make a living, and they have reached a situation now that has become unbearable. The second reason is also that the unemployed is getting, the situation of the unemployed people is getting harder and harder. They have been stigmatized over the years by the politicians, and so the measures now to control and punish them are harder and harder. And then one of the main reasons we see basic income as an answer is because we think that it would be a good answer to combine social and fiscal and climate justice. And then the last slide. So, what now? Big question. I would like to conclude maybe, because there is a lot of topic and maybe we'll be able to talk about it in the questions, but during the Yellow Vest movements, the government decided to launch a national debate. So there were debates all over France saying what should we do and what are the solutions. And so you can see here, or maybe you can't see really, but it's in French, so you can just trust me, what were the main topics of discussion during this debate. And the main topics of discussion are clearly fiscal justice, fighting tax havens, raising the purchasing power. But then you can see there, at the bottom, there's a small circle green that seems to be growing, and that's basic income. So we saw that basic income is clearly approaching to the center and becoming to be bigger and bigger. So I will conclude with this optimistic conclusion. Thank you.
We'll move straight on to Romain. We'll have plenty of time for questions. So.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Since this morning, we've heard a lot of things about universal basic income. We've heard all the problems it could solve. But I will talk about universal basic income. I will talk about trust. Trust to me is everything. Trust is really important in your love life. Trust is really important with your business partners, but also in the human society. And I think that trust is a big issue now in France and the Yellow movement. According to you, quick poll, what is the percentage of French people, not Yellow Vest, French people trusting the political parties? What would you say? 50%? 20%? 2%? Yeah, you're close. Between 3 and 9%. Almost nothing. Why so? Of course, there have been deceptions after deceptions, and kept promises one after another. But I would like to highlight first 2 points. Firstly, and my Dutch fellow knows it, in 2005 there was a referendum in France, and also in Dutchland, in Holland, a referendum on the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe. French people said no, voted no to this referendum. We don't want this treaty. 2 years later, what happened? The parliament voted it. It was a big fracture, a big shame for the French people. The second point I want to highlight is, maybe you know that, we have a new president, Mr. Macron. And he's kind of a provocative character. Nicole talked about the sentence he said. He also stated that some people are nothing. Or now, during demonstrations, who was the first that get arrested? The paramedics, the first aid benevolent. So they can't help the wounded demonstrators. That's a provocation. This is about Mr. Macron, but not only about Mr. Macron. This idea of mistrust, of despise from the so-called political or even media elite, it's a long story. It goes a long way back. There is an 18th century sentence, really famous in France, saying, yeah, people voted for me to represent my views, not their views. It's a really good sum up of the French state of mind. So there is this mistrust, and French people can see it. They can see it in the laws that are adopted. For instance, 2 weeks ago, there was a privatization. Privatization of what? Of the lottery. What brings more money to a country than the lottery? They see it also in their everyday life. One of the big pride of French people was the public services. The public services are crawling down. And at that point, Mr. Standing was right. They are looking at a brighter past. The public services are crawling down. I will give you an anecdote. I love anecdotes. I've been several times in hospitals in the last years. Patients can't even have a bottle of water because hospitals don't have the money for that. That's crawling down. So they can trust politicians. Maybe they will trust other institutions. Do they trust, I don't know, the justice? No. We have a really low budget for justice, and there is a really long time between your fine and the judgment. Does they trust the police? Maybe if you have a question about the police, because I think it's a really big issue, we can talk about this, but just sum up, no. There has been a big change since 2015 on the police. Yet, another anecdote, just a quick one. Now, French police will not be allowed to use some really dangerous grenades. So, what are they doing? They are using a lot of them to empty the stocks, because after they won't be allowed to use them. That's the way of thinking. But if you want, later we can talk about the French police. Do they trust the mass medias? No, they don't. They are owned by 10 or so millionaires or billionaires, and French people really don't trust them. Well, what did I miss? The army. Yeah. How many people think, according to you, in France, that a soldier, a general, could lead France? 10% of the people? 50% of the people trust the armies to rule the country, and only the army. It's a big trust, but I don't think it's a really good point either. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know what's your opinion, but I might be wrong. Probably now, I will move to my last part, is a trust between citizens. Sadly, no. This movement, at the beginning, there was a lot of different kind of people. On the same roundabout, because I went to a lot of roundabouts, on the same roundabout, I found an anti-capitalist guy and an asset manager living in Paraguay. Two different worlds, but they wanted to be unique for this movement. It's a bit changing, sadly, and generally speaking, there is no really close connection between communities in France. They're not living together anymore, they're living side by side more and more. I'm not talking about all-breed French and new immigrants. No, some people are born there, their parents were born there, their grandparents are born there, but they don't feel French, and they will, I don't think that they will be. So there are clashes between communities. I don't know, maybe you heard in the news 2 or 3 weeks ago, there are some Romese people in Paris who were chasing down West Africans because the West Africans thought they were kidnapping the child to kill them. So there is mistrust between the communities. People from Afghanistan and Sudanese and each other, Tunisia, Morocco, and so on. What will I conclude? I don't know if this movement will go on. I don't think so. But people have learned. They have learned a lot. Yeah. 2 minutes. Oh, I just did one. I think this movement will stop, but years after years, people are more and more poor. And someday will come, they will have nothing to lose. That's really dangerous. And Kennedy said that if you make a peaceful revolution impossible, you will have a violent one. Sadly, that could happen. I love pause. How many people in France, not Yellow Vest, French people, think that the revolution, so violence, will be the best way to change things? 40%. That's a lot. And 81% of the people think that the so-called elite, the gap between the so-called elite and the people will grow. So, to conclude, they will get more and more poor. They have seen the repression, and a really hard repression, we'll talk about this. So, now they are more and more angry against the government and the police. They don't trust them anymore, as I stated. I fear that there will be some violent actions, like the Red Army faction, for instance, like it used to be in Germany, or the Red Brigade in Italy, because this repression can also lead to a radicalization of the members. Thanks for your attention.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm from Norway. I'll try to take you into a little journey around this with road tolls. Everybody got an opinion about road tolls. But before I start, I would like to thank for the invitation, and we are happy to be here. Okay, do you hear me? No? Oh. It's okay? Thank you. Okay, good. Road taxes. We all have an opinion. And when we're talking about democracy in crisis, we have heard of monster, trust, politicians. The distance between the politicians and the people they are elected to serve are getting bigger. I speak for the road taxes, the demonstrations against the road taxes, how it inflicts on the people's normal day, travel till and from work, kindergarten, school. Why are the people so angry? We get new roads, we get public transportations. Why shouldn't we pay for it? If you look to the person next to you, and he is paying for your public transportation that you use for free, what do you think about that? Is that okay? These road taxes, especially around the cities, these rings with toll stations, they are excluding many people living outside and work inside. They are paying for public transportations that the people inside these rings can use. You're living outside, you can't use it to go to the job, to work. Is that fair? I don't think so. So someone is paying for something that others are using. That's one of the reasons that people are getting so angry. I can take you back to the beginning. I'm from Stavanger area. We had, in Norwegian matter, we had a riot, but compared to France, it's nice demonstrations. We are nice guys. But in Norway, it's quite new, big demonstrations like that, and over so long time. People suddenly noticed that their income wasn't enough for the normal days. Suddenly somebody came and said, you're going to pay 1 month's salary every year for something that you are not going to use. But we need it. I don't say that the projects are bad and we don't need it, because many of the projects we need to do something with this climate changes, the environment. But it's not the right way to fund it, to finance these things. It's so unfair, it's unsocial. And I asked the politicians once, are you in favor for social including, or are you against social including? And of course he said, I'm of course in favor of social including. That's the whole thing. Yes, and then I asked them, why are you willing to put in systems who can result in social exclusions? Then he got still didn't have a good answer. So they are in favor of social including, but they are putting up systems that exclude many people. It's not everybody, but it's so random who's paying. Is it your neighbor who's paying? Is it you that's paying? So that's the unfairness of these road taxes, the toll stations, where they are putting them up. Just outside our hospital, there is a toll station. If you have to go to the hospital, you have to pay to come to the hospital, and then you have to pay for the parking, of course. So, the trust in the politicians, the democracy in crisis, Why is it happening? We elected these politicians. We trusted them. Why aren't they doing what they promised us? Somebody will say, they are doing what they promised. They're taking care of the environment. They are building more public transportations, trains, buses, more and better roads, yes. But who's paying for it? If I said to you, 1 month's salary every year, that's, in Norway we have feriepenger. We get paid for the month we have holiday. If I came and took that away from you, would you be mad? No? You can afford it. A single mother looking forward to their summer holiday, to take the kids somewhere you normally do. But this year they can't, because she's paying to go to work every day, because she can't use the public transportation. The public transportations are built up in the cities, not outside the cities. I'm from a little place outside a big city, but I can't use the bus to go to work. I have to use the car. And I have to pay for all the citizens that are using these public transportations. I don't think that's fair. That's like you're paying for the dinner for your neighbor. He's going on a restaurant and you pay the bill. And at the end, I would like to, many of you have heard about knock and knock, Norwegian demonstration. Everybody using knock and knock. Everywhere. Pomfrit Norge, my organization, was born, so the daylight, in the middle of these demonstrations on the west coast around Stavanger. Because we saw that we needed a platform where we can speak with the politicians. We are serious organizations. They are listening to us. We can speak with them. We can speak with the demonstrants. Because the politicians, my experience is that they won't listen if you shout. If you go out with banners, yellow vests, they won't listen. They hear you, yes, of course, they hear people screaming out. But they are right. The politicians know the best for us. And we have a platform where we listen to the people, we bring it on to the politicians, and the way back. So we operate as a platform where we go both ways. And now on Monday we are meeting with the Department of Transportation in Norway to discuss the people's demands or issues, problems with the department. And we bring it back to the people afterwards. So just one thing you can think of at the end. Yeah, I'm going to finish. That's who is paying for your transportation? Is it you yourself or is it your neighbor? Thank you.
Our next speaker is a Dutch mayor, but I'm not going to try to say the town that he will tell us because it's unpronounceable to most human beings. But he will tell us.
Well, I think in Wales there are even more difficult names. I'm mayor of the city of Heerhugowaard. It's 50 kilometers above of Amsterdam. That's more. That says more to you, I think. I will have my introduction in 4 parts. I would introduce myself. I did already a bit. Then I would say some words about our democracy in crisis or not. And then share some words with you about what is the new democracy, which is about, which will probably come towards us. And then at the end I would say some words about how in the Netherlands we work towards that new democracy. Well, first, my name is Bert BLASE. I'm introduced as mayor. I am since 10 years, already my fourth city in the Netherlands. So I'm part of what we could call the old system, the old democratic system, where I'm trying to work with a lot of people from the city, but also from the city council and colleagues, mayors. We're trying to work in the transition towards new democracy. So why should this old democracy now be in crisis? Well, we see that our voters, you and me, we are drifting, and we are not voting every election for the same political party. Sometimes we even don't vote, or we vote extreme because out of a feeling of protest, or we vote not with full-heartedly on a political party, and it's all to do with the fact that, well, we have 100 years or more even with education, with emancipation. We have a digital revolution which gives us all information real time, on the spot, whenever we want to. But the democratic system, especially the representative democratic system, does not really fit with our mindsets. It's a system of, well, the past, how do you call it, the past century, but we are in a new century. And this mismatch, well, we're going to feel it. And I think you also said the gap between what you call the elite and the people is felt to be larger. And this mismatch has also to do with that we have to vote our representatives for a whole package instead of the subjects that, well, we really are interested in. And for, like, say, climate, we want to vote left or right wing, and for another subject we would vote, well, just the other way around. But because we have to vote for the whole package, well, it doesn't fit our way of living at these days. So the representative democracy, it's well, how do you call it? Well, there's a mismatch. Okay. And what we're trying to do is to think what is this new democracy which would make an end to this mismatch. What comes when the political parties diminish and they become less interested for the voters? What comes instead? Well, this democracy which is coming to us has some main characteristics. It's not a top-down democracy, it's a bottom-up democracy. Let's say the people's movement is leading and not following in this democracy. There is like citizens' assemblies. You have perhaps heard of it, citizens' assemblies. People should come together and decide what is good for their city, what is good for their country, and they don't want to be dependent of a political party which says which way we should go. So these citizens' assemblies are important. And also like online and offline consultations, so that people are really in the position of give their opinion, and not only give their opinion, but also be able to decide, like a referendum or a preferendum, or what I call the citizens' assembly, which are people are voted by tradition, which are also new ways of democracy. And the last characteristic is, I think, the transparency. So it should be in the open and not in, how do you call it? Closed doors, with closed doors. No, it's in the open. So these are characteristics, and we try to develop a democracy. In a local democracy, we see it more often happening, that it is an interaction between the government and the people which are involved. But at the national scale, we see it not really happening a lot of places, but we see coming up these new forms of democracy. And in the Netherlands, we have given it a name. We call it Code Orange. Well, because it's the Netherlands, we call it Orange. But code, it means also Code Orange is when the weather is becoming broadcasted and it's bad weather. We say it's Code Orange, and when it's really very, very bad, it goes to Code Red. So we say the democracy now is in Code Orange, but Code also say co-democracy, the democracy of togetherness, of solving it together. And that is one of the main characteristics of this new democracy. We have in the Netherlands give this movement, try to give it a place in parliament. And one of the 100 Netherlands is now voting for this new movement, which is rather a lot, because people vote for something they do not already know, because it's new. We are walking the bridge and building it at the same time, and it's not easy to imagine what we vote for when we vote for a new democracy. But still, one on 100 people vote for that. So it's quite a movement which goes through all Europe, especially through the northwest of Europe, and I hope you will join this movement. Thank you.
And finally, we have Ali from Turkey, which is constantly has crisis, which is anything but real democracy. And just after the recent elections, maybe that has changed. So I'd be very interested to hear his perspective.
We should discuss during dinner time. Oops. It's okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Guy. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ali Mutlu. I am representing Citizens Basic Income Turkey. First of all, I would like to thank BN Norway and the Norwegian Civil Society for the successful organization and their kind hospitality. The title of my presentation is Universal Basic Income and Democracy Practice. Maybe I will somehow differ from your presentations, but we are at the same panel, so I have to continue. At the beginning, I will try to remind few public information which you may know, and then we'll finalize with some of our thoughts regarding UBI and democracy practice. Oops. Okay. The first group of reminders are regarding the United Nations. This is a September 2017 article at The Guardian by Daniel Boffet from Brussels, and whose title is Robots Could Destabilize World Through War and Unemployment, says United Nations. And it's giving the news that United Nations opens new center in Hague, Netherlands, to monitor artificial intelligence and predict possible threats. And the author writes that from the risk of massive unemployment to the deployment of autonomous robotics by criminal organizations or rogue states, the new Center for Artificial Intelligence and Robotics has been set the goal of second-guessing the possible threats. It's not a working group, or it's not a committee, or it's not a temporary something. Much more seriously, it is the first permanent United Nations office for this theme. We think this is a very interesting indicator. Next slide is almost after a year after this article, the previous article, last autumn in September 2018, during the opening speech of the 73rd session of the United Nations in New York, Secretary General of the United Nations made the opening speech and said that technological advances may disrupt labor markets as traditional jobs change or disappear. He also added that the very nature of work will change. Governments may have to consider stronger social safety net programs, including and possibly universal basic income. We believe that this is another important indicator regarding the perspective of the United Nations. We may or may not agree with the policies of the United Nations, but considering the amount of resources being allocated and used by the United Nations, we should consider their findings seriously. Considering these two developments together, very clearly they are estimating a massive unemployment risk in the world. We believe that this is not the exact description of the risk, but the correct one should be maybe social unrest or social instability risks due to massive unemployment. And these definitely may lead to a crisis in democracy practice. And another reminder. The second reminder is about an article by Harari entitled "Why Technology Favors Tyranny." And it is published at the October 2018 issue of the monthly journal, The Atlantic. In fact, the cover page title of the journal was also "Is Democracy Dying?", which is quite relevant to our panel discussions topic. Harari structured his text in 4 parts. The growing fear of irrelevance, in fact, quite similar to precariat concept, but after you. Yours is first, definitely. A new users class, the rise of digital dictatorships, the transfer of authority to machines, etc., etc. But you can easily Google this article and read the full text, but the important motto from the article is the same technologies that might make billions of people economically irrelevant might also make them easier to monitor and control. So this was a second reminder. Yes, United Nations is the first reminder, the other one is the Harari's article. And we have another reminder, last reminder. In fact, it was a longer presentation, but due to the time limitation, we squeezed them up. The third one is, and the last one is from a presentation by Bart Jacobson. I hope she's here. Oh, nice to see you again. During the Universal Basic Income Europe's General Assembly and workshop meetings in Berlin a few weeks ago. The title was Basic Income Experiments, Dead End or the Way Ahead. She made a summary of the basic income pilots so far in Europe and pointed out that during the experimental studies, what is actually being experimented is not the UBI as defined by Basic Income Earth Network. We should take it as a reference, I believe. She also added that these are leading to dangers, like what's being tested is not a real basic income, the experiments are time limited, so behaviors may be different from a lifetime basic income. They may not be considered as scientific. The criteria is different for different pilots. They are not testing the same thing, etc., etc. And even something like this, the governments are often looking for different outcomes from these experiments, etc. I totally agree with her. I would like to give an example regarding the Finnish experiment, for example. During the BN 2018 Congress in Tampere during last August, we had a Finnish guest who was a part of the ongoing UBI experiment, and there was a question to him and to the audience also, and the question was, we have very big expectations from UBI. Considering that the experiment will end at the end of the 2 years, do you think within the framework of such an experiment one can feel the real touch of an universal basic income concept in their life? The answer was no. Okay, up to here I try to give 3 separate reminders. Now I would like to share some of our thoughts regarding UBI and democracy practice, again in a dispersed fashion, but in 10 separate paragraphs. Let me put this also. I will come to this at the end. The first paragraph is, the full independence of the people is very important for democracy practice. And it is a first condition or first criteria is economical independence. In societies where economical independency of its members do not exist, democracy may, in fact, will definitely lead to unhealthy results for the society. Therefore, considering the massive unemployment risks in the close future, UBI may have a quite crucial role for a healthy democracy practice. The second paragraph is, in addition, especially with today's technologies, tracking and recording of political choice of a person or a group of people is becoming very, very easy. If the society can't provide necessary resources to its members to survive with dignity, in other words, provide a reliable income floor, their arms might be twisted and they may not be successful to reflect their free will to their political choices, namely to their votes. And this is another danger for democracy, and UBI may secure people to reflect their free will to their political choices. Third one is about cross-border effects are very important. Regarding UBI related efforts. A referendum or an experimental study or a pilot or a campaign somewhere around the world is being watched by all people of the world. Therefore, we have to be very careful and sensitive regarding the success of such attempts, and all the UBI advocates should be acting in solidarity. In fact, tomorrow in one of the sessions we will try to propose something related to this sayings. The fourth paragraph is we are encountering and coming across with different versions of universal basic income, campaigns, experimental studies or pilots, and most of the time these are degenerating the universal basic income concept. We believe, I think this is the most important part of our presentation, unconditional and vital mission of all basic income advocates should be to protect the character and soul of universal basic income. We believe this is very, very important because this degeneration, we don't know where it may take to us. The fifth paragraph is, some people consider universal basic income as a populist policy in negative sense. In fact, definitely it isn't. So UBI should be very carefully launched as a repellent agent to negative populist policies. Sixth one is, we have to be very, very careful regarding the universality of the basic income models. If the universality character is not protected and some kind of social policies are adapted for some category of people, then it may turn into a political bribery, I'm sorry. Definitely we should fight with any misuse of the UBI terminology. You will remember the case in Italy during the last year. These kind of populist approaches should heavily be criticized all around the world by all of us. Ooh. Okay, there's a 2 minutes. Oh, okay. Democracy is the only tool for the realization of the UBI, and universal democracy must and will enable the universal basic income, which in fact will be the savior of herself too. And the last one is, we may consider advocacy or fight for universal basic income as a sailing boat. And these days, the technological developments are blowing strong winds to the sails of this UBI boat. But we must be very, very careful. Instead of reaching to the UBI harbor safely, we might have a sunken boat or a boat on top of the rocks. And lastly, I would like to put these two points. One of them is, unconditional and vital mission of all basic income advocates should be to protect the character and soul of universal basic income. And the other one is, universal democracy must and will enable universal basic income, which in fact will be the savior of herself too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we've got 2 themes that I'm going to ask the panel to respond to. One is what Ali has just raised, which is that, are we going to make progress politically in democracies by going partial way, or is that going to lead to a cul-de-sac where we don't make political progress? I know that my own political experience, I believe in pilots. I believe that we're going to be incrementally making progress, but I'd like to get your responses. And the second thing is that, again, I apologize in a sense, but when I was analyzing and listening around the world to the precariat, the imagery that I put in the book about the 4 A's, which do you think of the 4 A's are the greatest threat to democracy? The first one is alienation. Alienation where millions of people feel they have to do a lot of things they don't want to do. And they can't do things that they would like to do. That sense of alienation, right? The second A is anomie, Durkheimian anomie, a sense of despair where you feel you're not going to be able to improve, you're not going to be able to have social mobility, and that's frustration and so on. The third is anxiety, the sense of insecurity, uncertainty, a feeling that the system doesn't allow for security. And the fourth is this sense of anger. So which are the, in France, in Norway or Scandinavia in general, in the Netherlands and in Turkey, have been the dominant threats to a sense of real democracy for the 21st century? So I'd like you to reflect on that, and then I will open it up. So if we have just a couple of minutes, and you can raise your point that about Nicole's that you want. So let's start with Nicole.
Okay. Hello. Does it work? Well, I don't know personally what would be like the most important fact, and I don't like to prioritize, but I would say that in the French context, maybe it all started with the alienation factor, the fact that people have to go to work to make a living, but then they realize that it is not enough, and so it's also linked with the feeling of desperation at that point, because the media and the politics, they say that you need to work to have a decent life, but then when you're working it doesn't work, and so what now? And I would say that in the Yellow Vest context, that's precisely the problem, because what the politicians and what the society more widely has been telling us to do has not answered to our personal issues. And so I would say that then what happened was the feeling of anger, because there was this feeling of unfairness, and so now we're in a situation where people are going on the streets and they're saying, I'm not going to move now because on the 15th of the month I don't have enough to go to the supermarket and buy some food. So either the politicians and the government make good decisions and they raise the purchasing power, they give back the wealth tax, and there's more social equality and more fiscal justice, or we are going to stay here. And now the feeling of anger, I would say, is the most important and the most pregnant in France.
On your first question, the democracy with little steps, I'm going to make a lot of enemies here. Because if you go in France and ask Yellow Vest if they want a universal basic income, a lot of them will say no. Why? Because they don't want to have to ask for something. They want to ask for, I don't want to have to ask to the government for 1,000 euros. I'm not living in the street, not a homeless, begging for something. They want to ask. They want to make their own laws by referendum. They want to make their laws, or they want to amend other laws, or revoke representatives and so on. So I would say, in France, right now, people don't want small steps. They want some sovereignty of their own lives. So I don't think that this small step policy is now the current trend in France. And which is, if you want to know, this ID is called in France RIC, in English ICR, CIR, excuse me, Citizens Initiative Referendum. And the second point, I will differ from Nicole, I wouldn't say alienation, I would say anomia, which leads to anxiety and anger. They are linked, obviously. But I would say anomia because someone who is angry can do bad things, but is still thinking. As I stated before, a desperate man is much more dangerous. A desperate man has nothing to lose. So he will put on some, as I state in general, at the head of states, or it will start civil war by bringing guns to the street. By the way, you have 10 to 15 million guns in France. So for me, the real challenge for democracy is not alienation, not anxiety or anger, but alioma, despair.
Yeah, I could say almost the same. Like Nicole and Romain said, but I would make a point that anxiety and anger, because the Norwegians are starting to they're lacking trust in the politicians. They're wondering what next. What will happen next if we don't stand up now? Where will it end? So that anxiety, they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow if the politicians don't listen. And that again leads to anger, because when you're anxious, when you're uncertain what's going to happen, then you go into defense and you get anger. So yeah, I would say.
Yes, I think mic, okay, by this mic. As I have said in my introduction, I think the mismatch between the system which is old and our minds which are new, that is the main problem. People don't want to give away their mandate for 4 years and then relax and do nothing. They want to have influence. And that mismatch, that's in my opinion the main cause of all the anger and frustration.
Thank you very much. I believe, I guess anxiety is the most dominant factor. If you consider the case in Turkey, but that's all I can say at the moment. Anxiety.
Good. Okay, I'd like to open it up for questions. Start there, yes. I'm going to take 3 questions and then ask the panel to respond.
Peter Knight, Sufficiency for Sustainability and Network. It's particularly for Bert, but for all of you, how many of you heard of the system of quadratic voting? And this is where citizens are given a number of votes that they can apply to the issues that they feel most important on. They can vote more for things they feel most important on. Is this part of the new democracy movement in the Netherlands, for example?
Yes? Is that part? Yeah.
Something fell down. It was a cell phone.
Yeah, I just wanted to, well, a couple things, but first is just to quickly clarify that I'm not against doing pilots of basic income, all right? It was more just sort of the dangers and the factors that we have to think about. And also, we also discussed at that meeting about how, the pilot, how the winds can change, we saw in Ontario, that sort of thing. What I'm really more interested in is the whole idea of citizens' assemblies and sortition, and just explain to people a little bit more that for citizens' assemblies, which are being used in Ireland to huge effect for the issues that politicians don't want to come out on. They're actually chosen by a kind of lottery. So if you're used to the jury system where people are chosen at random for the population, it's something that I've thought about and advocated for a long time, so I was very happy to hear that come up tonight.
The third question, anybody? Yep, there. All isn't it? Yeah.
Love the 4 A's, but I'd say that they're symptoms. So I'd like to lob a French police grenade into the discussion. What about the causes? Democracy in crisis. I would suggest a B. The billionaires who've bought politics for decades and decades and decades.
Dark money.
Dark money indeed.
Okay. All right, so which of you would like to respond to those questions? Quadratic Citizens Assembly.
Yeah. Perhaps I could.
The plutocracy.
I could begin because you mentioned me. I would say a big yes to your suggestion, and it's part of a new democracy. And also the thoughtition which you pointed, and in regard to that, I think we should more experiment with both your suggestion as yours to gain experience and to learn, rethink the democracy. And in Holland, this is your next question, there are a lot of cities who want to experiment with the basic income. And I would say, let's do it. And let's not wait until the whole country begins, but let's, step by step, every city that wants to, do it.
Romain? Can you take the
Yeah. I don't know if I have a quick answer for the billionaires comment. However, there is of course this problem, but I think that there is another problem. The revolving door system, which means that some public officers, after the judge, after the mandate or the judges, go to the private sector to earn a lot and then come back in public services. I think it's a link for these billionaires to put some pressure on government officials. And this is my answer.
Anyone else? Okay, let's have another round. Any other questions? I have one that I'd like to ask, but I don't want to be taking priority. Yeah.
One thing that might be far away is of course changing the political systems, but what about making a system that is so good that we could vote in random people and it would function? That would make it hard for the lobbying people harder to find their targets, the one they want to change their minds of, and of course these people might be harder to buy. So, how about changing the political system? But again, money has made more people, more poor people than it has made rich people. Let's change that.
I think there's a big risk in your idea. Supposing that lottery system came up with the name Donald Trump, I don't think we'd like it, or Nigel Farage. I think I would hope that we could arrange something better. The question I would like to put to the panel is this. There have been experiments done by psychologists where they gave options to a large group of people about a system of justice. And usually in those tests, people are asked to write down what they support as a principle of justice. And then they put that aside and they subject the group to a period of discussion, deliberation, where they deliberate. And those experiments showed that the process of deliberation led to a big increase in the percentage who concluded that the best system was having a basic income as a flaw. So it went up from slight majorities to 80% after a deliberative democracy. And I found that I live in Switzerland, where we have cantonal referenda a lot. So there's a lot of that deliberative thing. Do you think there is scope in your different countries for an improvement in deliberative democracy?
Third question?
Sorry?
Third question.
Yeah, the third question. So I see, where is the third? I get, sorry.
Yeah, this question is to anybody, any of the panelists, particularly the chair. Guy, you've been talking about the plutocrats controlling. This goes beyond the state. And so far we have been talking only about the politicians, but then beyond politicians you have the plutocrats actually controlling the system. That is one aspect. The other aspect is the modern technological revolution, the new technologies, the internet, the connectivity that we have across the country, across the globe. What kind of new democratic possibilities that opens up to people to have a voice?
Well, who's going to start? Romain? Yeah.
You listen. Thank you. First, I would say, for this comment of understanding, there will be a need of freedom of speech, and there is no freedom of speech nowadays in France. I don't know for Norway. You will tell me. And generally speaking, in a lot of Western countries, there is always what is called in English the Taina idea. There is no alternative. Politicians always use this trick to do some censorship over the freedom of speech. They always say there is no alternative. For the system in Switzerland, I don't think it will happen in another country, because for a really, really easy reason, people who get the power don't want to let it to other people. It's easy. And just another thing, I don't remember who it was who was talking about a system of voting, which is the best way, the worst way, etc. You should look for Voxcracy in France, which is a startup which is doing exactly this. Where you can vote for your favorite subject or person, then for the second best, third best, and the worst. And they propose to adapt the system with this method.
Nicole?
Yes. Yeah, I would like to answer to this question about the deliberative democracy, because I think that basic income is actually a good example in this case, and especially in the context of the Yellow Vest in France. When you see that the majority of the people who are part of the Yellow Vest are people who work but who are precarious, you also see that the unemployed are not there. So the speeches we see in the roundabouts, etc., is that the main claim is they want a decent job, and so we keep with this reproduction of the value of work, valuing the traditional sense of work, and they keep also with the same speeches which stigmatize the unemployed. But then when you start deliberating and also debating a lot with these people, then you can change their minds, especially talking about a basic income, because it's not well known enough, and then you can like trigger a paradigm shift this way, but this needs time, and we saw like the scope I show you with the basic income, that was like the small circle at the bottom on the right side of this map, is because we started also organizing debates. So the more you debate, the more people have choices that are thought like collectively.
Just really, really quick. You're missing something, I think. People love to have leaders. They love to follow, like in a cult. It's a bit the same way in politics. So they want to be led sometimes by someone. They want someone to trust.
That's why you got Hitler.
You want to say something before Bert? No?
Well, first, a modern country doesn't need one leader, but needs 1 million leaders. So we're all into leadership. You questioned about the deliberative democracy, and it is a Swiss model. I think there's a lot of to gain from that, and I think it's one of the fundamentals of the new democracy. And also, regarding to you, sir, it diminishes the influence of lobby, because about money I learned once that money is like cow shit. When you spread it, it's a blessing, but when you concentrate it, it stinks.
Ali.
Regarding Saad's question, how to utilize technology in the democracy practice, if I'm not mistaken. I think liquid democracy might be an interesting solution. I mean, considering if it is merged with the blockchain approach, this kind of discussions are ongoing in Turkey too. I mean, we are receiving some briefings, but at the moment, definitely they require some legal infrastructure. So it has to be first technically possible, then it should be legally permissible. Of course, financially feasible, but feasibility side is okay. But technically it's possible, but it should be legally permissible. It still requires, how I can say, political. I mean, it still requires a political approval. I mean, in a political arena, I mean, in parliament or somewhere else. That's the problem. I mean, the technology is there. Technically, it's possible, but to have it legally permissible and have it applicable is something a different problem.
All right, well, we have to conclude then. We've gone over our time. I won't respond to Sarat's question to me. But listening to the responses around the table reminded me that recently I had the dubious pleasure of spending a day arguing with Boris Johnson. And he was trying to say, listen, what's the point of the European Union? You don't know even who is the president, or it doesn't, you know, it's ridiculous, right? And I said, well, Boris, I live in a country where I honestly can say that most of us in Switzerland do not know who the president is today, because it's a revolving person and that's constantly changing. I'm sure Enno does, but most of us, I often ask in the auberge, who is the president at the moment? And they all look and say, we don't know. And it's a perfectly functioning system, and I think there's a lot of virtue in that. So I really think that there are lessons to be learned from some of the experiments. But clearly democracy is in a crisis. We can all agree on that. And insecurities and inequalities are contributing to that. And the dangers of populism, the dangers of neo-fascism are so real that I think we are in a very interesting position where a lot of people who would not normally be our allies politically, and I've been invited to Davos and speak, but those corporate people are now saying basic income is needed because they are worried that democracy is collapsing because there's not enough legitimacy there. So I think this panel, whoever decided on this panel is well chosen, and it gives us an extra dimension in our argumentation. So I'd like to end by thanking our panel, because I thought that every contribution was very good. So thank you very much. Ali wants a last word before we go.
I would like to say something. In the business arena, you heard about the winner takes all. That concept is also coming into picture in the political arena too, and I believe it's very, very dangerous. And the winner takes all concept, if it's flourished or if it's, if it's there in the political arena, then all the businessmen, all the, big entrepreneurs, they will all be in risk also. That's why this blockchain concept, decentralized concept, is much more suitable for all the parties, all the groups. Thank you.
We'll come back to that tomorrow. Thank you very much.